The reading is from Nehemiah chapter 13, starting to read at verse 1. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zaccur, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay my hands on you." From that time, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you so very much, Catherine, and good morning everybody, and lovely to see you. And just scanning the room, I don't think there's anybody I don't know, but just in case, my name's Heather. It's lovely to see you. And we are here in Nehemiah. This is our last week on Nehemiah. Winter has turned to this lovely spring while we've been looking at the book. We've been going through it for quite some time now, and we've reflected much, haven't we, in Nehemiah? We've reflected on prayer, in things being won in the spiritual realm and then spilling over into kind of the favour of things going on earth. That was right at the start of the book when Nehemiah prayed, and then the next day was shown real favour by the king. We saw the people persevering in their faith and in their action. We were challenged in Nehemiah to respond to things that just aren't right. There's themes of justice and renewal of following God and true worship and devotion. And we also saw in Nehemiah, and have done, a people of God operating too, a people coming together under often great threat and opposition. And I think sometimes in the sweeping story of when these events and things are recorded in different books of the Bible, it's easy to forget within that kind of narrative that each person will have had their own experience of what happened in this time. I once heard a little bit about when you look back over certain times of your life. When it's very recent history, you perhaps remember all the details, and then as time goes on, you maybe remember the bigger themes. And then some psychologists say as even more time goes on, you just maybe have a basic impression maybe of those times. But one of the pervading images for me in the book of Nehemiah was when the people were working on the walls and they still had their weapons on them at all times, just this constant feeling of threat, constantly expecting attack. And so in these chapters, in late chapter 12, and then today, as Catherine has brought to us in chapter 13, we see the people dedicate the walls. We see the people express their devotion to God, very rightly. But also they have cause to ponder, to remember the things that have happened. They've kind of come to the end of a monumentous period, really. We see that in Nehemiah, don't we, at the end of what Catherine read for us there. Remember me for this, my God, and show me favour. And so a question to ponder as we begin really today: what has brought you to this point? As you sit here today, perhaps in history, maybe in your life of faith, what are those things that have brought you to this point? I'm sure there are many. How has God moved for you? What barriers have there been, maybe? What seasons of your life, good or bad, most come to mind as you look back over your life of faith, maybe over your time here as part of the church family? Nehemiah says, according to the greatness of your steadfast love. And whatever various stories come to mind, I would have thought common to most of us would be the love of God, the greatness of his steadfast love, a love that sustains us and comforts us, that celebrates with us in joy, that walks with us, that makes a way where there's no way, all the other wonderful things that God does for us, all of those things. And today there's a response to that. The passage begins, on that day they read from the book of Moses, and it goes on a little bit about how they separate themselves. And it's worth repeating, as I have before, that separation from the Moabites at the start of the passage is nothing to do with racial prejudice or anything like that. It was just that there were alternative gods, there were alternative practices that were against God's law, and that's what this separation related to. And if you were here when I mentioned this before, I made reference to Ruth in the Bible, who was a Moabite but declared, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And God worked in very supernatural ways to bring her into the fold. So it's really worth repeating that in these kind of themes that could be so easily misunderstood. And people seek to establish God's temple and ways. But I don't know if you spotted there the priest who becomes blind to the purposes of God, very close to the beginning of the passage. Bias and favoritism can be very destructive in many contexts. So here we have a priest of the Lord. Instead of attending to the temple of God, he's making a bit of a luxury apartment in the temple for none other than one, his relative. We're told Tobiah was his relative. And then earlier in Nehemiah, we're told that Tobiah had been one of the key opponents of the progression of the building of the wall. And I don't know, I'm sure there are many representations of different working lives here, but I'm sure you'd be familiar with the idea of a code of conduct. Maybe you've written one even, maybe you've been a manager, maybe you've sat under one. Whatever it may be, I think somebody getting a little favour for one's relative would definitely go against said code of conduct. There's no concern for the right things here, is there? And hopefully not to this kind of immoral extent, but we can get stressed over the wrong things in church life, can't we? Our attention can kind of go off on the wrong way. We might worry how things might be received that we do or say. We might feel pressure to please certain people, or sometimes at the expense, of our kingdom purpose. And so we're called to allow before God to bring our hearts, to bring our motivations sometimes, to make sure that God's kingdom purpose is at the heart of all we do. And that's part of our prayer life, because we see here, don't we, it is easy to get distracted and to think about other things. And to maybe get pulled away. And Nehemiah sees how that is operating. He sees that the temple is being compromised. He sees the lack of code of conduct in the priests of God. And he acts to preserve all that has been done. He takes steps, doesn't he? Quite violent steps, really, throwing out all this guy's furniture and just making sure that the temple is preserved in the way that it has been built and in the way that, to the best of his ability, he is perceiving that God wants it. And there's a call for us there too, isn't there? For sure. So when the job is done, as it was today, a bit of an application here then is, can we keep the integrity and the spiritual momentum going? In this passage, Nehemiah has finished the task. He's gone back a little bit to where he came from, back to his neck of the woods, if you like. He's come back to see how things are going on. He's monitoring and he sees more that's not right. I think I've mentioned to some of you, I used to be a primary school teacher, and so the word Ofsted still fills me with utter panic and dread. And when I was looking at you again, Holly. So when I was an NQT, I actually went to a school in special measures, which was quite challenging, but they had just been deemed to have improved enough to employ newly qualified teachers. So that was an experience. It was a challenge, but it was a great opportunity as well. And as happens in these cases, a big sort of executive team was brought in to turn things around, led by a lovely lady, well, she was lovely but very driven, lady Claire. And she actually came from a sister school, and they had an outstanding Ofsted. And I was really struck by how much she was still in that area of her responsibility, the kind of outstanding school. And she spoke about it one day, and she spoke about how easy it is when a school gets an outstanding grade to then just rest on their laurels and actually decline in quality. So I was quite struck by that, and that's a little bit what I see with Nehemiah. And that can be true in our spiritual lives. Paul says in one of the letters, when you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. And so I'm struck here by Nehemiah's actions, and I think we're challenged too. When the job feels done, when things feel good, when we feel full of faith, what practices are we putting in place? What awareness do we have that it's so easy to slip back perhaps into some more unhelpful things? And for Nehemiah, the thing that he's preserving here is the people's devotion to God. He mentions in this context, he mentions making offerings, distributing fairly according to need. There's a big theme of worshipping in particular on one day of the week and making one day of the week really special. Ultimately, though, he says this: why is the house of God forsaken? And so there is a challenge here again. Where have we as individuals, or even as a body, forsaken our call, even to a small degree, to devotion and worship? And sometimes we can be really practical with these kind of things. I was chatting to somebody this week, a fellow clergy, and just something as simple as she said she'd put aside some time on a Tuesday morning because she felt like her prayer was just kept falling off the end. Yeah, as a clergy person. So we can get very practical, planning in our prayer time to read the Bible, maybe coming to church when we don't feel like it, especially as the weather gets warmer. Initiating a conversation with somebody else perhaps about the fact we attend church, our call to evangelism, always there. Whatever it may be, let's ask God to tell us how it is that he's calling us afresh to devotion and worship, because as someone, again, uncomfortably once said to me, Heather, if you ask God that question, he will always answer it, because God longs for us to flourish, and he also longs for us to know who we are and to find our purpose in him, and where he calls us to obedience and sacrifice, to do that too. So I think we are ready to finish our time in the book of Nehemiah, aren't we? I think we're ready. I feel that. You probably feel that. But I hope that throughout our time there has been some, certainly for me anyway, some challenges, and I hope for you, some encouragements, and also some real wisdom as we seek to walk in faith and walk with our God. And so I'm looking forward with you to descending, if you like, into Easter as we come into April just now.